Hello everyone, and welcome to my Vue Toronto talk. Usually I give two kinds of talks. First one, if I'm excited about something, some kind of new technologies I've tried in production and I'm really happy about it and I'm happy to share something about it, or I speak about something that causes pain. And this is clearly the second kind of talks. Today we will speak about some ways to make your Vue unit tests better, and unit testing is hard. Let me quickly reintroduce myself. My name is Natalia Tepluhina. I'm Vue.js core team member, and if you read Vue documentations, there are high chances that you've read something that I was writing. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, and I work as a staff front-end engineer at Gitlab. And as you might guess, this is a talk about pains of staff front-end engineer, because at Gitlab we're using Vue for our front-end development, and of course we're writing unit tests for these Vue components. And I'm not only a staff front-end engineer, I am one of front-end maintainers of Gitlab. And as a maintainer, I merge things to master. As a maintainer, every single day I have many code reviews, and I noticed an interesting thing. 80% of my comments on merge requests are on unit tests. So as a team, we already developed some best practices in writing Vue components, component composition, architecture, and so on. But we still have issues writing Vue tests, and we are working on it as a team. Because there are not that many best practices about unit testing, especially unit testing in Vue. So I decided to share a few things that I usually left as comments on my merge requests, to share some GitLab developed best practices on unit testing. And I hope this will be helpful for the wider audience. So let's start with the fact that we are going to use Vue test utils with Jest. Still, I will be sharing a few common practices that doesn't really depend on the library or test runner you are using, but all the examples are going to use Vue test utils with Jest. And this is mostly Vue test utils 1. Still, every single practice is applicable to any kind of other Vue application. So, first moment, understand what to test and structure your test accordingly. This is an important moment when you just start with the test, with even a structure of the test. And to do it properly, let's realize that we are testing component output, something that is an external contract of this component. And if you struggle to understand what component output is, first of all, this is rendered template. This is an HTML that we are showing to the user. This is component output. Clearly, this is emitted events, because our component, of course, is interacting with other components, with the parent level. And it emits events, so this is component output as well. And this is side effects. If we're using Vuex, component can dispatch Vuex action. If we're using router, component can call router, push router, replace anything of the router methods. Calling imported functions, making requests as well. I mean, in the application, this is mostly imported functions because probably you're using an API layer. But still, this is all the side effects. So 3 main things: rendered template, emitted events, and side effects. And when I joined GitLab, most of our tests were structured like this. Describe methods, and then we're testing every single method in the component in isolation. Describe computed, and then we're testing any single computed property in isolation, passing parameters, changing component data, and just checking what computed is. And then there was a template. Testing what is rendered with a snapshot. It was literally to match snapshot or wrapper HTML. And this is very wrong, because we are only testing component output in the last part of this test with a template, and we're not testing this output properly. Computed methods and component methods and computed properties by themselves are not the component output. We will touch this a bit further in the component internals, but for now, just understand that testing it like this is not the correct way. What would be a better solution? Imagine that we have a component with this simple template. We have some property loading and we show loading text when it's happening. And when we're not loading, we either show an error if something happened, or we're showing some kind of data. Just 3 blocks with conditional rendering here. And in this particular case, how we would be structuring our test is, when loading, it renders loading text, does not render error message, and does not render data. So we use our template as a starting point of structure the test before we even write in the test. When there is an error, we don't show loading, we show an error message, and so on and so on. This looks like a very simple, basic finite state machine, but it works perfectly, especially for testing some complex templates with lots of conditionals. And after this, I would add something like component emits an event or component triggers an action when something happens. Here, we only touching the component output. And this is really important when you're writing unit tests. Second is you have a structure in mind, and let's start with component factory. What is component factory? It's just a little function that we usually call create component. And what it's doing, we create a wrapper variable on the root level describe. We will be using this wrapper all across our unit test in every single test case. And our component factory, in the most basic moment, just shallow mounts the component. And this is easily extendable because we can add variables to create component. We can pass props we want to assign to the component. We can pass any kind of data, any kind of additional things to create component. And we can then add them in the shallow mount right here. And then we should not forget to destroy this wrapper after every single test case, because we want to start with a clear canvas, with a newly created component. Why we're doing this? Why would you need this component factory? It gives you a feeling that this is a premature abstraction, maybe. Because imagine that if you have test cases without component factory, like it tests something, and you say wrapper is shallow mount, props data, and so on and so on. Then you have a second test, and you have again const wrapper is equal to shallow mount, and you change everything there. And then you have more, and in fact you have more and more and more, and you repeat yourself in every single test case, because you're just creating a const wrapper, and you're shallow mounting your component. To simplify this, it's quite easy to create component as a factory. And also you will be aware right in the beginning of the test when reading or reviewing it, what parameters this function accepts. So what cases you are going to cover. It's a simple optimization, but it's very useful because it saves you many lines of code and it creates a nice abstraction level. Third one, again quite simple, is using helpers to find elements and components. So when you're unit testing, you probably search for some elements of the template with a helper that is called wrapper.find if you're searching for HTML element, or wrapper.findComponent if you're looking for the component. And what we are doing at GitLab, when we are searching for a certain HTML element in your template or for a certain component in your template, we create these little find helpers. As you can see here, like find confirm button, find model, and you just specifying what you are looking for. Then you are using them in tests this way. You just call find model and check if it exists. Important moment when you're writing these helpers, these should be functions. Because if you write it with assignment equal to wrapper find component, you will have an error because find component doesn't exist wrapper is undefined at this point. That's why it should be a function that is called somewhere in the test case. Why would you need this? Why would you need these helpers? First of all, this is readability, because you can name them the way you want, even if you're searching by absolutely unintuitive selector, like confirm or better success. With helper, you can give it a proper semantic name, and it will be easy when you're reading the test to understand what's going on here. And second thing, why? This is a real life example. We had a button with data test ID create button that was doing something, was disabled on a certain condition, and on click was calling a certain method. And we had a bunch of tests for this button. And all these tests were using wrapper.find data test ID is equal to create button. And after this, we were doing the global refactoring within Gitlab. We introduced a component library, and our button now is a component. It's GL button. And in all these tests, we're going to replace this button with data test ID to find component GL button, or maybe giving it some additional selector. And even without a replace, it's still a lot of work, because you need to check that all test cases are replaced correctly. And when we have this helper with Finder, it's quite simple to just go there and replace it in one place and still use the same helper all across the tests. It's an improvement that saved us hours of our work. So if you're going to write tests, especially if it's like massive test for massive component, helpers are very helpful. Next one. This is absolutely my favorite, because I'm seeing people violating this rule every single day. At GitLab and outside GitLab, do not test component internals. Our component is a black box. We are passing something. We are passing props. We are setting up the external store, maybe if we're using Vuex. We're setting everything in environment for component. And we test the component output. But people tend to use component internals instead. What do I mean? Imagine that we have a simple component that has a counter and it has a computed property that calculates the double of this counter, and there is a simple method just to increment the count. Only three things. And how do people structure their tests? First, it calculates double correctly. We are setting up a component, we are passing the data, and create component is setting data under the hood. And then what we do, we are checking wrapper.vm.double is equal to. And this is super wrong, because here we are testing a component internal. We are checking the computed property instead of checking the component template, where this property should be rendered. And the second one, again, super favorite, is calls correct method on button click. So we are creating a component, we are spying on component method, and we make sure that when we click a button, this method is called, and our component data, so wrapper.vmCount, is 1 now. First, and important, if there is a method that is assigned to the button click, and you're checking if this method is truly called on the button click, you are testing the framework. You're testing the Vue itself. Framework ensures that when you click the button, it calls the method that you put there. And second one, again, we are not checking the component output. We are checking the component internal. We're checking if count is 1. This is bad. Let's take a look at component template now, and let's figure out how it would be better to structure the test to test the component output instead of component internals. So here is our template. We have a count with data test ID, and we have a button that increments this count with the increment count, and we have, of course, a double. So some field where we are rendering this double. Let's take a look on the test structure now. So how we would test for double. First of all, we are writing the helper. As you can see here, we are just searching for data test ID double. And then we are setting up the data with count1, and we expect our HTML element with data test ID double to have a text count x2 is equal to 2. Of course, this tests only one input, so you can go fancy and you can write the test spec with it.each. So here we are passing a few different properties. So when we have 0, we expect 0 to be rendered. For 1, we expect 2, and for 100, we expect 200. This is very naive test. Any QA engineer would probably put some things like null here, but still, we're going the happy path, and we expect the text to be count x2 expected. Here we're testing component output. We are doing it with a rendered template, and this is a correct way of testing the component. And now for the method. So we want to make sure that method is doing a thing that we expect it to do. So what we're doing here, we create a component, and by default in our component, count is 0, so we don't need to set it up. And here we are expecting, first we expecting count to be 0. Then we go to the render template, we find an increment button, and we emulate the click. Then we are waiting for next tick until the component is re-rendering, doing a microtask, and then we're expecting find count text to be count1. Here we're not touching component internals at all. We only operate with component output. We will touch a bit on next tick in the upcoming one as well as following the user, but for now, as you can see, we're not using any wrapper.vms here. So to summarize, a few rules of thumb. Forget about asserting wrapper.vm. In your tests, only wrapper.vm you're using could be wrapper.vm $emit when we're emitting an event, or next tick. If you are doing anything with wrapper.vm, especially in assertions, you're doing it wrong. If you assert wrapper.vm, you are testing component internals instead of component output. Second one, do not spy on methods. You should check that method is called. Only checking its result, so maybe a method is changing your reactive data and you can check the rendered template as an output, or if your method is calling some side effect, spy on the side effect. If it's calling some imported function, mock it and check the function was called. If it's doing an asynchronous request, check that request. And third, my favorite rule of thumb, if you rename method to computed, test should pass. Test knows nothing about component internals. Such as your user. When your user clicks a button and sees account incremented, user knows nothing about component internals. Follow this rule, and not touching components internals will make your test better, more reliable in general. So why we're doing this? Why we want to check the rendered template output? Quick example. If we look here, you remember this template, right? We are rendering count x2 double. Imagine if I, a developer, made a mistake. Maybe I worked too much, maybe it's Friday, and I'm like, put their count because I just copy-pasted something. And this is already wrong. It should be double here, but I forgot about it. And if I check wrapper.vm.double to be 2, the test will pass. Because computed property does its calculation. But if I check a rendered template expecting the text to be 2, it will fail. And it should fail. It shall not pass in this particular way because my component is operating in a wrong way. It shows us the wrong value, and unit test should be red in this particular case. Follow the user. This rule is very similar to what we just had in the previous explanation, but we will go a bit deeper on this particular case. So you remember this template: count, increment button, and count, x2 double. And you want to test it, so what you're doing is like you're creating a component with count 1, you expect double to be 2, and then you want to test it again, and you do wrapper.vm.count is equal to 2. First of all, this is wrong. This is against Vue test utils rules, and here you are changing component property directly. This is very incorrect. You can play by the rules and do a wrapper set data count too, but still here you're touching a component internal. You're not following your user. What would your user do for incrementing the count? They would click a button. And this is something you should do as well. If you're going to test, either separate test cases like we did in our it.each. So create a component with like separate initial data with count 1, count 2, count 100, and check the output. Or if you're absolutely adamant about checking the double after incrementing the count, click on the button. Follow the user behavior. Do what user do. If user clicks on the count, on the button, you click on the button as well. Do not change wrapper VM directly. A rule of thumb again. The less wrapper.vm you have in your test, the better. Child components are black boxes. This rule will probably bring some holy war. And we started already with like Lords of the Ring theme, so I used the same picture here for mount and shallow mount, because there are many discussions about if you should mount the whole component tree or you should use shallow mount to only mount the component that you are testing. And I'm a big fan of the fact that for unit testing, you're following a shallow mount. Why? Because, so first of all, why? In this particular case, because when you mount the whole component tree and something fails in your furthest ancestor down there, your parent component test will fail. Even so, it should pass, because your parent component is completely fine. There's something wrong down the tree. So, to explain a bit how do we test child components there, imagine if we have my button component with a slot that renders child component button text, and when we click on it, we want to increment child counter. Very similar to what we had, but imagine that button is a component in this particular case. How would I test this? First of all, I would check that our child component props are 10. Not what is inside child component, not find child button VM something is equal to 10. No, I'm testing the props, because props are external construct of this component. Props and emitted events. That's everything that I want from the child component. And the second one is I want to check the increment. So I'm going with checking the text, emitting the click, and then checking the output. I'm emitting the click. This is important because down the line, my button component uses a native click event. If I mounted the tree instead of shallow mount, I could use a native trigger click. However, I have no idea what is happening inside of my button, and so should my test do. That has no idea what is going down there in the child button component. It only knows that component can emit an event click, and parent component should react to this event. So this is what we're doing with a component. We are treating them with props, attributes, and events, and that's it. And one more thing that was there across all the tests, don't forget about Vue Microtasks. This often happens when you were testing component internals, when you operated with wrapper.vm properties, and then you switch to testing component output. People forget that Vue requires a next tick to apply changes to the component template. So this is something you have just seen. We're emitting an event click, and then we are waiting for the next tick. And only after this, we are checking that counter changes. If you don't follow this rule, you can jump into false positives, especially if you're like, okay, it should be the same it was previously, and it will be until you wait for the next tick. Don't forget that next tick is asynchronous, so you would need to wait for this. Hopefully, this was a helpful talk. Hopefully, it will improve some unit tests across Vue users. And thank you.